So what we'll talk about today are sort of three very practical strategies to help your students catch up on their writing skills. How SAJack, which is the platform that I'm here representing, can help in this particular process. And we'll have a bit of a walkthrough of the SAJack platform as well as some Q&A. And again, Tamana was kind enough to do a bit of an introduction. I won't spend a lot of time on this particular portion of the slide, but it's helpful for those who will be watching this in a recording. SAJack itself was founded by two professors, and I think between the two of us, we joke that we've taught every grade from pre-kindergarten all the way up to PhD. And again, my focus specifically has been on English language and literature, and I taught high school grades 9 to 12 in Canada before going on and doing the master's, PhD, postdoc, and becoming a university professor, where not only did I teach contemporary Canadian and world literature, but also taught teachers how to teach writing and taught critical thinking and writing courses focused on the pedagogical underpinnings of writing in an academic context. Now, a bit of a summary in this, again, many of us who are teacher practitioners, so either at the high school or the college and university level, already know this, know what the research is telling us, which is that there has been significant learning loss in various jurisdictions as a result of the pandemic and the way that it has disrupted traditional learning. And there are lots and lots of reasons for that, not only it being sort of a surprising leap into an online learning environment, often without necessarily much training. Some of us have been lucky and have had really great teaching and learning supports at the institutions where we may find ourselves. Some of us are learning how to sink or swim in an online learning environment without necessarily having a lot of grounding in that. Depending on where you are, this learning loss, some students are looking at being up to 3 years behind. And again, this is a significant equity issues in the sense that depending on what their connectivity is like at home, depending on what their experience throughout the pandemic has been, those skills that they may not have mastered in the past 18 months can then be compounded as they fall further and further behind in the future. And again, some of the data is quite negative in terms of suggesting that some students, particularly at these critical ages, so grade 11 and 12, and then first and second year university. So these really kind of foundational moments in their educational journeys. Some of those students with some of the literacy and numeracy skills that they may not have a solid foundation in through no fault of their own, but through the fact that they're living through something that is quite unprecedented in the lifespan of their educational journey, and quite frankly, in the lifespan of many of ours as educators, some of those students are at the risk of not necessarily ever recovering in terms of their educational potential. And so this, in our case, is something that we're really concerned about and want to be able to intervene in this space. And as a pedagogy informed learning platform focusing specifically on academic writing, this is the kind of piece that I feel as though we can add some help and make our intervention into this space. And there are a couple of reasons, 5 outlined here on this particular slide, but sort of I'll bubble up a couple as to why there is a particular difficulty with learning loss in writing. And one of the key things is because writing is one of those skills that is so iterative, and it really benefits from modeling in class. So creating communities in classroom where we are teaching and talking about the kind of expectations of academic writing, whether that's a book report or a speech or an academic essay, or even once we get into sort of the kind of graduate research papers, that becomes really difficult. The other component that can be tough and that can be lost for students is that there's that lack of a face-to-face interaction for writing support, lack of face-to-face community with their students. And again, a third kind of problem that sort of bubbles to the surface as we're thinking about learning loss as it pertains to writing specifically in our sort of pandemic-informed world that has shaped what's going on in classes is that typically for students who are learning English language arts and other supports, there's a kind of cohesion across institutions. There's a kind of standardization, and sometimes that gets lost as teachers and institutions and instructors are scrabbling to make sense of how to address their particular subject areas in an online environment. And so some of those cross-curricular standardizations around writing and expectations around writing can sometimes get lost in the mix and then have deleterious effects. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today, and that are the kind of focusing questions for addressing learning loss as it pertains to writing, are how can we improve remote learning, specifically in the context of writing? So accepting the fact that it may well be that some form of distance learning, digital learning, hybrid learning may well be here to stay, not only because of the uncertainty around some of the variants specifically related to the pandemic, but also because some institutions are now finding themselves changing, and the expectations of both students and learners may well have changed and not go back to what was the standard of education before. And so how do we improve that context if some elements of it are here to stay, whether we want them to be or not? The second kind of focusing question is, how can we bridge that gap created by some of the learning loss that students may be experiencing when it comes to academic writing in particular? And then the third one is how to create robust systems for teaching and learning writing. So how can we systematize this? How can we support some of our colleagues who may have less familiarity with teaching in these online, digital, and remote environments? So we've got three key strategies that we'll kind of focus on a bit today. So the first is providing a solid foundation. So this is the solid foundation for both the students and the instructors. So a kind of structure and consistency that can then be repeated as a pedagogically informed standard for academic writing, in place of what can sometimes be some of those really sort of beautiful iterative moments that can happen in class, in the absence of some of those beautiful moments. And I do hope that there will continue to be those beautiful moments that happen serendipitously in classes. But in the absence of some of that in an online learning space, the thing that online learning can do well is really provide that solid foundation. So we'll talk about how to make that possible. The second core strategy to help to create independent writers as students are grappling with the potential risk of learning loss is to teach them self-editing and peer review skills. So in the absence of a classroom where they may be able to workshop things with colleagues, they will have to develop a kind of confidence in themselves as emerging writers. And if their principal engagement is going to be between themselves and the computer and people mediated by that digital divide, one of the things that's going to be super important for those students is to develop that sense of confidence that they can navigate that learning environment as it relates to academic writing. And then, of course, the third piece is how to accelerate their learning with respect to academic writing. So instead of just thinking, oh, okay, well, they may have suffered some learning loss, let's throw a bunch of content at them and hope that they'll be able to recover. It's how do we get them to accelerate beyond that sort of uncertainty and that potential hiccup that they may have experienced, so that they can go on and be lifelong learners with respect to academic writing and achieve their success and buck the trend in terms of those statistics suggesting that some students may fall behind and not necessarily get to where we want them to go. So a little bit about what providing a solid foundation looks like. One way that as educators we can be familiar with is creating a scaffolded approach to prevent students from being overwhelmed. So right now, by and large, across a variety of disciplines, students are feeling that sense of loss, that sense of uncertainty with respect to a number of different disciplines. So creating a foundational structure that says, okay, this is step 1 and 2 and 3 with respect to academic writing can be very helpful, particularly if they're not in a context where they're surrounded by scholars who are modeling academic writing and academic speech in the way that we would be more familiar with in long and extended classes and writing workshop contexts, as well as certain writing centers are closed. Certain writing centers now have longer lineups for students to be able to get in for in-person consultations. Creating a kind of standard approach that they can use on their own can be really helpful. And again, that ties into this idea of consistency. So the more that students are getting the same messaging from a variety of different sources, the more it can be standardized from one class to the next, the more they will then begin to feel comfortable in that solid foundation. So again, we've got some sort of how do we create structure? And again, typically people like me would tend to say, oh my gosh, we don't want writing templates. That's going to sort of absolutely get rid of the creative and critical process when it comes to academic writing. That's terrible and formulaic. But now in this sort of new digital era, there's a lot of research that comes out about how to create smart writing templates that give the foundational structure for how you write. And again, that's typical things like an introduction, a body, a conclusion, what constitutes a logically flowing argument, and then giving space for that creativity that we want to see our students develop. So where is that line between giving them the foundation that gives them confidence, giving them templates that helps them to know the boundaries within which they're playing, and then they can start to break those rules and become a little bit more creative. Whereas in the absence of that structure, students are unable to necessarily make the right choices with their academic writing. And then again, that point about consistency. So streamlining their writing tools, streamlining the kind of templates that they're using across the board so that, again, they're not getting a set of lessons from one instructor that are radically different from the set of lessons they're getting down the hall from another instructor. These are some of the key principles that both we can employ in our individual classrooms, but also as members of educational community. So how can we work with our colleagues to really foreground this sense of consistency across the board with respect to writing? And then the next point, the next strategy is to empower students. So we start off with the foundation and the structure. The second is now how do we help to build up that confidence so that students can be confident writers? And one way, again, is building up the ability to provide self-analysis and review of their writing and to work online with peer review in a way that goes beyond sharing a Google Doc amongst student colleagues where the gist of the kind of feedback that they give each other is, great job, good for you. We want them to learn how to be critically engaged readers of texts, their own and the texts that their colleagues are writing, so that they begin to see the act of academic writing as participating in and in being involved in a community of scholarship. And so how do you create that community of scholarship as a student in the absence of, say, on classroom communities, and the ways in which we can create those classroom communities, particularly if they're disrupted or sometimes hybrid, being able to really create a framework that allows students to develop these key independent skills is really important. So again, providing guidance and explanations on how to review using standard rubrics. And I'll give you an example of a standard rubric that can be really helpful in terms of self-review as well as peer review. Some of the research that has come out in terms of peer review, and this is again a thing that I sort of flagged for you in your own teaching practice, is that there are pros and cons to making peer reviews anonymous in and amongst students. So if you've got a cohort of students and you assign a peer review activity, you can do that anonymously and students can give each other feedback. Of course, the downside is if they don't necessarily do a great job, there's sort of no way to gauge who provided that subpar feedback. Secondarily, students then can't themselves aim to aspire to be like the best students. And so sometimes there's a benefit to not having those peer reviews be anonymous because it can set some valuable benchmarking amongst the students themselves. Again, with respect to peer review, same as for self-review, it's important to have some kind of standard rubrics and guidelines. And so two of the points underpinning both this sort of foundational point number one and this second point in terms of empowering students lies in giving them tools that are standardized. So templates and writing guidance, and then rubrics, which is the kind of outcome guidance with respect to their academic writing. And there are a variety of different ways in which those rubrics can be deployed in online contexts. So now we get to the third point, and this third point is the accelerate point. So we go, okay, great, we've got some foundational elements, writing templates, standardization, writing across the curriculum that's standard. Great, we've got some outcome-oriented standards to help give students confidence around rubrics and guidelines of expectations and modeling. Now we get to this third piece, which is, okay, so how can we get them to overcome loss, and not just overcome loss and achieve grade level or achieve the expectations in our college and university level classes, but how do we get them on a path to acceleration? How do we get them sort of off to the races with respect to their own learning journeys as it pertains to academic writing? And so one of the things that is really important is incentivizing practice. Again, which is incredibly hard in online environments. I mean, as you're experiencing now, often, we end up having classes that are shaped by video lectures. It can be harder to develop that kind of confidence in the writing cycle through practice and feedback and improvement and repeating. And so that's one of the things that the more that we can incentivize and almost gamify the writing process, the more students will be capable of practicing and improving over time. And so there are a variety of different ways in which we can incentivize that practice. And so one ties back to this idea of scaffolding the writing process, which is having them practice small component parts. So even in, say, a Zoom breakout room, you can have students go in small groups and craft just a topic sentence for a particular essay they may be writing. Or you can have them focus on just finding the appropriate quotation in the analysis of a poem to then support a particular thematic point. There can be these small group collaborative learning opportunities that are really focused on specific tasks. As well, then those small group collaborative learning opportunities focused on specific tasks can translate into individual writing opportunities on the part of students. So what happens in, say, an online learning environment in a breakout room can then be replicated in a task that they can take away to perform in small kind of chunks. So that can be a helpful tactical and practical strategy to incentivize this kind of practice on component parts. Then, of course, another additional sort of tip and strategy that can help in terms of this acceleration mode for students is to be able to provide asynchronous tips and videos for them so that some learning happens in the class, whether that's an in-person class, whether that's an online class, but then what are the supports that students are now starting to expect to exist in the digital world? So even if you're in a context where you're lucky enough to have everybody back to face-to-face, students have now, to a certain extent, been trained to expect a lot of material and a lot of support to be delivered to them digitally on their own time. And so what does that actually look like in writing? So in some other subjects, those are practice questions, those are textbook questions. In terms of crafting an argument in a humanities or social sciences academic writing context, practice questions don't necessarily foot the bill in terms of how to accelerate that learning. So creating small video tips and small chunks of content that students can consume and use as guidance on their own time can be really helpful as they accelerate their own learning in the absence of that in-class environment. So again, before we get into a bit of a demo of how EssayJack as a writing platform can put into practice some of these strategies, a bit of a review. We're sort of looking at three core aims and strategies. One, that solid foundation, which can give that structure and consistency. Again, templating and scaffolding and guidance at the start of the writing experience. Then we've got this aim to empower students, which gets to the more outcome-oriented piece. So how do we create rubrics and clear expectations so that as students take that guidance from the templating and the structure and the scaffolded approach at the beginning through to their own writing practice to then be able to evaluate and iterate in that writing process. And then of course that entire step 1 and 2 is hopefully so enjoyable and so wonderful that it helps students to be incentivized to practice and practice on their own, so that there's a lot of self-directed e-learning that can happen asynchronistically to whatever happens either in an online class or an in-person class. All right, I will now toggle over to SAJack itself as the platform that can help put some of this all into context. And so hopefully you're seeing, this is the part where it turns a little bit into an infomercial. So permit me for a bit. This is the SAJack website. And of course, I hope that you and your colleagues and of course your students will check out the website and see all of the resources therein. Again, this was developed by myself and my co-founder, lifelong educators. So it's not sort of a gimmicky ed tech that kind of emerged in response to the pandemic. We first launched this in 2015, and this is really our intervention into the drafting space, so that instead of focusing on what sometimes the educational technology industry as a whole focuses on, which is sort of catching students once they've plagiarized, or trying to sort of de-incentivize cheating, we sort of said, okay, well, actually, let's just give them that foundation at the beginning. So that's a little bit of SAJack, and certainly there's all kinds of resources that you can look at on your own time. So now I'll jump into my account within SAJack. And again, we're not going to talk about every single feature or function, and this won't be sort of an infomercial on SAJack, but just focusing on the kinds of tips and strategies that we've already gone through in terms of that foundational piece at the front end, the sort of iterative and outcome-oriented self and peer editing piece for students as they're writing, and then of course throughout it all trying to accelerate them as lifelong learners, so that they're taking the skills, tips, and tricks and using that in their own life beyond what happens in the classroom, as things as well are changing all the time. And we want our students to feel as though that they've got the skills and the strategies so that whatever unfolds in the future, whether that's more pandemic or back in person, that they're able to learn in the way that they need to. Because the other sort of bit that I haven't talked about, but that there's a lot of research about, once we are all back in 100% face-to-face classes, the diversity of skills and aptitude in those classes will be broader than it has ever been before. And so we'll have students at the bottom and top end of skills and abilities across disciplines. And so being able to say, okay, here are the ways in which if you're behind, you can catch up and accelerate your learning. And here are the ways in which if you're actually okay, you won't be held back by what's happening in the classroom. So there'll be a lot more of that kind of independent learning, or at least the scholars who work on this are suggesting that there will be a lot more need for certain kinds of self-paced e-learning as we all kind of adjust to the new normal going forward. So without any further ado, we'll look a bit at SAJack. This is simply an SAJack dashboard. The core feature and function that we're going to look at today is what's called in this realm essay drafts. And it's not just essays, it's a bit of a misnomer. We've got book reports and speeches and academic essays and lab reports that students can create within the SAJack framework. We just call them all pieces of text we kind of call essays. And then we'll look at the reviews function, and that's to that question about rubrics. That's where the rubrics are housed, and we'll talk a little bit about that self-paced peer review and self-review on the part of students. And so what a student encounters, and again, this is what you can use, whether this is in an in-person class where you've got a smart board and you want to be modeling the components of academic writing, or it's like this and you're on some platform like Zoom, some video conferencing, where you want to provide students with an overview of what constitutes the kind of academic writing that you're looking for. And then they've got something to sort of take away with them to use in real time. So to that first piece, that foundational piece of how do we create a scaffolded structure that is standardized across the board and that gives students the necessary foundation for success. In SAJAC, we have what are called templates, and this templating approach is really our attempt to provide that solid foundation within the flexibility that students will need to then become the best academic writers that they can be. And so, as I say, there's these built-in templates, the academic essay, which is the most robust and the most expansive. So for more advanced students at college and university, that's really where you want to focus them so that they can add a section on methodology, or they can extend the evidence and explanation infinitely. There's persuasive speeches. Again, that's probably for more of the high school level, but again, it provides a valuable foundation, particularly in English language learning contexts, where students are going to have to practice their oral speaking capacities on the back of a written foundation. Again, we've got book review, the standard 5-paragraph essay, which I know at college and university we hate, but it is one of those staples at the high school level. And in some ways, again, in that context of creating a foundation, it can be a very helpful heuristic and foundation for some of those early writers learning the basics. Again, we've got some additional like an advantages, disadvantages essay, and agree, disagree, a narrative essay, which again is very helpful for students who are starting to think about different generic conventions. Narrative is one of those genres that they can easily kind of wrap their heads around. Stories are one of those foundational pieces to human existence, which students can often use as a way in thinking about writing for the first time. Of course, TED Talk, you never know when students are going to become famous, but it's again, a genre that students are familiar with. And so that can be a helpful foundation, again, particularly in contexts where there's both a written and spoken component to what you may be teaching in the classroom. A compare contrast essay, again, is a very sort of typical standard genre. And the argumentative essay. So we'll start with the academic essay. If you're using SAJAC in a class or a university, you can access your institution, but anybody who signs up for an SAJAC account, and you can do so yourself for free, and you've got a 7-day free trial. And if you need to extend that, you'll have our contact information from myself and Tamana, and we're absolutely sort of happy to make sure that you're happy in your trial experience of SAJAC, either as an educator or once you want to get your students on board as well. Or you can also just point your students to this and they can create their free trial and see if it works for them. So now, once I've chosen that academic essay template, what SAJAC has done is it sort of spooled up this scaffolded framework. And so what we have on the left is the essay kind of in miniature. We call it our subway map. So we can see introduction is comprised of the topic, the background, the thesis statement, a bit of a roadmap foregrounding what's to come. The body section in this particular essay, there's going to be, say, 5 points. So this isn't your typical 5-paragraph essay with an intro, 3 paragraphs, and a conclusion. Here we've got 5 points. And I'll also reiterate, depending on what the student writes, each point isn't necessarily just 1 paragraph. A point is a unit of information, and a point may actually be comprised of 3 paragraphs, depending on how complex that argument becomes. So again, just to sort of show a bit of that flexibility within what is still ultimately a template. So within each point, you've got your topic, sentence, background, evidence, explanation, and it all ties back to the thesis statement. Each point is sort of comprised of those same basic components. And then you've got the conclusion. We do have a citation function. So again, it's reiterating for students to constantly cite their work. If they've cited something, it will be listed automatically here in their list of citations. If they say delete that quotation and thus the corresponding citation for that particular quotation, it doesn't get removed immediately from their sort of SAJAC draft that they're creating. It gets preserved here under works consulted, so that, again, there's no inadvertent plagiarism, which is, again, another sort of risk that students can be potentially dinged on without knowing. So again, that shows this sort of essay in miniature, the introduction, the body, conclusion. If we go back to the introduction and see those component parts, I'll close this off so everything is as simple as possible. We can continue to sort of follow along as we write. But each of these sections is, so the technical term is actually that it is a chunk. And so for those of you who are English language instructors, you'll be very familiar with the idea of chunking. And so instead of teaching, say, word by word, obviously, as we teach English language, often we chunk segments. So orally, that would be something like, instead of just teaching hi, how are you as independent units, we'll say chunk that as hi, how are you, and teach that as a whole in an oral context. And so expanding that into the written academic context, chunking is a way of breaking down more complex and longer units into a coherent whole. So in SAJAC, we've built in that pedagogy. So each of these sections, topic, background, thesis statement, the roadmap section, as we move down to the body, they all operate as chunks. And then of course the value add, and this gets to that third point in terms of acceleration for students, making it something that they can practice and practice and practice. Of course, take one look at me, and I'm very obviously not of the generation that is a digital native. We joke that I'm a digital immigrant. I have come to the world of technology as an adult, whereas many of our students, particularly if we're looking at that grade 11 to kind of first or second year university age range, sort of 16 to 19, they are quite honestly digital natives in a way that is entirely different from how my brain was wired. And they operate in these small chunks. So they're used to their smartphones and very small units of text, as opposed to, say, a big book or a big article. So that is, again, a way in which the pedagogy behind language learning and academic writing dovetails with sort of student expectations around being overwhelmed by too much text. Another component that's helpful, and I'll sort of show this a bit in action, is that we have these sentence starters, or sometimes sentence stems, academics refer to them. And that's, again, to help get students started. So one of the things that they grapple with when tackling a writing task is the tyranny of the blank page. And so how do you even get started? And of course, these sentence stems are not giving students content. They're giving them a starting point. So an important question in the study of whatever it is, the significance of whatever it is that they've been assigned to write about. And so this is a generic academic essay template within SAJAC. As an educator, you could customize it. So the first one says the book, insert title by, insert author's name. If I have assigned a particular writing assignment and I want the students to write about Macbeth, they could use this, and then I could edit it so that it says the play Macbeth by William Shakespeare is about, and then they're off to the races with that first sentence. And again, this is kind of de-incentivizing those sentences that sometimes students attempt to write, which is the, since the dawn of time, man has thought about. And of course, as academics, we want them to jump in and get started right away. The third sort of pedagogical piece that this platform is offering students in terms of that standard foundational templating experience is these interrogative prompts. Jump right in. What's your focus? What special vocabulary or information do you need to share? What do you want to convince somebody about this topic? What do you want people to believe by the end of your essay? So each of these chunks, each of these sections not only has specifically scoped sentence starters or sentence stems, again, which are all editable by you, the instructor, if you've got an instructor-enabled account. But there's also these focus questions, these interrogative prompts in each section, which again incentivizes the students to realize that they're writing for a reader. So it's not just a content dump of all of the thoughts in my mind. It's, oh, there's going to be somebody who's reading it and they need to be engaged, and I'm engaged in a communicative act in some way or another. And so that's the kind of third pedagogical piece in this templating foundational structure that we're trying to provide for students, so that they've got this basic starting point when it comes to their academic writing tasks. And then the third piece is we've got these additional tips and prompts. So once again, there's the definition. So what is topic? What have you been asked to write about? What do we expect in a first sentence? And that's also entirely editable by an instructor. So for instance, if you say, great, Essay Jack provides this off-the-shelf academic essay template, but I don't call the first sentence topic. I call the first sentence, opening sentence, and I want that to be repeated with my students. You can absolutely change that, and you can change the definition. Same goes if you say, well, jump right in, what's your focus? That's the interrogative prompt that Essay Jack is suggesting. But in my class, I use slightly different language, and so I want that reiterated. Again, that's entirely editable. And then there's a space for additional tips and prompts, and then video guidance that sort of walks them through what's expected at each section. So background as well. And again, that's all kind of editable by you, the instructor. And so I'll skip ahead as though this is like a cooking show where now I've just chopped up all the vegetables and then stuck them in the oven, and now magically I'm going to open the oven and we'll be able to see something written. And so now I'm opening up the oven, and instead of just seeing chopped vegetables, we now have this entire meal. And so to push that metaphor into absurdity, this is the essay that the student has, say, written. And so they filled in each of these component parts, answering the questions that the interrogative prompt has asked them, and begun filling out the component parts of this particular short essay. And again, at any point while they're writing, they can see their essay being built in miniature. So as the student adds more here, hello, it starts to fill in real time right here, so that not only do they get to focus on these small chunks, but they get this sort of satisfying experience of seeing something that actually looks like a real essay, a real document being produced for them. Again, they can see it at a glance in its largest form and scroll down if they're writing something longer. If it's something short like this, they can certainly see it just in this split screen. What we found is students often like this split screen. They like the scaffolding of step-by-step guidance, but then they want to know that in real time as they're writing, they are producing something akin to what they expect. And now, and they can download it and all kinds of functions. What I'll send this off is to send this for a self-review so that we can look at that kind of empowering piece and the rubric piece. So I've now sent this essay to myself so that I can go and have a look at it. So let's go to the reviews, and I see this short Macbeth essay waiting for me to review it. As a student, I can go in and review my own work. And so now I see this sort of short essay in miniature. As an instructor, I can then, if students share their work with me as an instructor, I can use this certainly to provide formative feedback along the way. I can even provide summative end grade feedback if I want. But it's particularly helpful for students learning how to review their own work and review the work of their colleagues. And so this is where the built-in rubric is within the Essay Jack framework. So we have this holistic overall rating rubric, and this is telling us, okay, what constitutes good writing? There's an excellent original thesis, sort of all the way down. And this looks at the essay or the piece of writing in aggregate. How is it? Is it great? Does it need more work? And then there's a place where the student, whether it's a peer reviewer or a self-reviewer, can add, additional comments themselves. Then the rubric gets broken down into the component parts of scholarly writing: content, organization, style, and mechanics. And again, this is where providing clear and articulate outcome-oriented guidance is really helpful for students when it comes to giving them the confidence to know that they're on the right track and they know what they're doing. So content, again, focuses on the ideas and the points, and they're perceptive and they are insightful. Organization, of course, if they've used Essay Jack, their organization will be great, but ultimately this as well talks about the way in which we're looking for an effective opening, that there's a logical flow of ideas when it comes to organization. Style, this is actually the area that students have the greatest difficulty with. Because again, this is one of those things that gets better with practice. It gets better the more they read and the more that they write. But starting to understand that choices around vocabulary and diction and the appropriate jargon for the field in which they find themselves is really important. And you can flag that here through this style. So they may have good ideas and it may even be well organized, but it may not be written to the scholarly standard that we are all hoping our students will aspire. And so this is the area where we can flag that point, and then students know where and how they need to focus their remedial attention. And then of course, spelling, grammar, and punctuation, which, everybody hopes can be improved over time. There are a lot of digital tools, and SAJAC as well has some built-in. We work with Grammarly, so if students have the Grammarly plugin, that will automatically start providing them with some of that mechanical support along the way. So that's ultimately, again, how that sort of rubric and self and peer editing piece comes into play in SAJAC. And as Tamina has suggested, we'll share the kind of foundation of that rubric with you so you can take it in future and adapt it as you see fit. So I'll go back to the SAJAC dashboard here. So we've looked at that sort of templating and scaffolding experience as it appears in the off-the-shelf SAJAC experience. And again, if you have an educator account, you can go into templates and you can edit that to your heart's content so that it looks exactly like what you want. And then reviews is where that sort of empowering peer and self-review piece lies and is rested. And then within this entire framework is hopefully a kind of easy to use self-paced e-learning context that helps to accelerate students when it comes to incentivizing that practice, practice, practice piece. So I'll thank you all very much for finding time to come and listen to me chit chat about learning loss, and hopefully provide you with some tips and tools and tricks that you can take forward. I will turn off the recording at this point, and thank you very much